that book was called Bad Science. And my friends in the physics community said, if you're interested in bad science, you should look at this stuff in public health. It's terrible. So I was, and I did, and they were right. That's a short story. I first did a piece on this idea that the electromagnetic fields from power lines can cause cancer. Wrote that for the Atlantic. That was based on the field of observational epidemiology, and everything I had learned from my first two books about what it took to do science right was considered an unnecessary luxury in the field of observational epidemiology because they couldn't experimentally test their theories. They didn't think it was important to experimentally test their theories. And so I've been writing about epidemiology ever since.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think it's not? Why do you think that they think that way?
Because they have no choice. It's essentially an observational science. When in the infectious disease world, you can basically test your theories by removing access to the vector of the infectious disease. But in the chronic disease world, classic example, saturated fat raises the risk of heart disease. In order to study that experimentally, since you're looking at a chronic disease state that develops over years or decades, you need an extraordinary amount of subjects who will adhere to, say, a saturated fat rich or poor diet for uh, years to decades, long enough that you could see a significant difference, if the hypothesis is correct, in chronic disease rates. Those experiments are exceedingly hard to do. They tend to cost tens of millions of dollars, if not more. And then it gets tricky. Since they've invariably tended to refute the hypotheses, the community has considered them unworthy of further pursuit. They'd prefer to tell us that the hypotheses are likely enough to be true, that we should change our diets. And when I moved into nutrition in the late 90s, I've been writing about and reporting on those issues ever since.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I recently wrote a piece that had to do with nutritional epidemiology and just how much of it is basically total garbage. They often collect data through questionnaires that are self-reported from people that can't possibly measure what they say they're measuring with any degree of accuracy. And then from there, basically just go on statistical fishing expeditions, and you're inevitably going to find some things that are significant and report on them. And not only does that happen, do those studies get published, but they often get a lot of public attention and media attention, which tends to propagate in people's minds the notion that the headline results, are in fact true and they're based on sound science, when in fact they're not.
Yeah, although, and I completely agree with you. Except I think that's not the major issue when it
Mm.
comes to nutritional epidemiology. Even if they could measure the diets perfectly, physical activity and diet perfectly, you still, from an observational study, it's this cliche, association is not causality.
Mm-hmm.
You ultimately end up with only an association that tells you that people who engage in a particular dietary behavior or physical activity related behavior have more or less risk than people who don't. And now what you have to determine is that risk determined by the behavior, or is it determined by the type of people who engage in that behavior? So for instance, the classic example, and what, you know, I mean, there's two now, ultra processed food consumption and the benefits of mostly plant diets and the relative evils of meat consumption.
Mm-hmm.
And it's funny, this was captured for me 20 years ago by a friend who said it's like they're studying, um, vegetarians in Berkeley who eat at the famous restaurant Chez Panisse after their yoga practice and comparing them to truck drivers in West Virginia who eat at Denny's, and then
Yeah.
saying that the difference in their health status is the meat consumed.
Mm-hmm.
And that is maybe a little bit hyperbolic, but even saying maybe might be a hypothesis. You're basically taking all the people when you study ultra processed foods, for instance, which is the latest fashionable research, is an article about it in the New York Times today. Um, People who eat a significant amount of ultra processed foods are very different than people who don't.
Mm-hmm.
And people who don't because they're health conscious
Yes, you're saying
and they
that
have reason.
other than the fact that one group eats ultra processed foods and the other doesn't, these people are different in many other ways. That and
Just
that's
that you can
why.
say, yeah, you can say ultra processed, the avoidance of ultra processed food is a marker of health consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
And not only is it a marker of health consciousness, it's a marker of having the socioeconomic status to be able to afford to prioritize health consciousness over other issues.
Mm-hmm.
The assumption of the studies is that the people are, in effect, equivalent. The only difference is that one eats ultra processed foods and other don't. They'll try to correct for things like cigarette smoking and weight and alcohol consumption, obvious problems, but the effects they're seeing are so tiny they could easily be explained. And I would bet my kids' college education on this, that they are explained by the difference in the type of people who eat ultra processed foods versus the type who don't.
Mm-hmm.
But these studies are relatively cheap to do. There's dozens, if not hundreds, of these population cohorts out there being studied. Now you see this trend where you even get researchers from China, most prominently, who can basically go into the databases that have been collected and publish papers retrospectively based on. When you said they're mostly garbage, yeah, it's garbage in, garbage out. But there's no way to even determine whether the garbage in has any causal effect on the garbage out, because you're left with an association ultimately. It's, to me, one of the two or three most important issues in nutrition science, but the nutritionists don't care to address it because it is their livelihood, or at least
Mm-hmm.
so I think.
Mm-hmm. And what are some of the factors that perpetuate this research? A lot of this type of research gets done. A lot of papers get published year after year after year. What's propelling that forward?
Well, the research gets funded. To stop funding the research is to acknowledge that there might be a reason to stop funding the research, which means there would have been a reason to never fund it to begin with. The researchers who do it, and I know these people, and I've actually co-authored papers with several of them, they fundamentally seem unconcerned with whether or not they're getting the right answer. They're so convinced they are that they don't see it as valuable to do the research necessary to demonstrate that to the rest of us. And ultimately, if you think of an association as generating, and this is how it used to be thought of back when I was young, you have an association between, say, eating a mostly plant diet and longevity. So that generates a hypothesis that eating a mostly plant diet will make you live longer. Infer causal hypothesis. The way you test hypotheses are in experimental tests. You can look for what they call consistency. So you look in different cohorts to see if the same hypothesis exists, but it's quite the same association exists, but it's quite likely that it does, because you're seeing the same confounding factors in every population in which you look. So ultimately, you have to do an experiment, and the experiments are these randomized clinical trials. And as I said, they're exceedingly difficult to do. They're very expensive, and for the most part, whenever they've been done, they've tended to fail to confirm the hypothesis. So you have a body of researchers who are, in effect, using a tool that might be incapable of doing what they would like to claim it's doing. And they're not going to stop because they get funded to do it. They have students who have to get PhDs. You know how this works. Those students have to generate papers and to put in the effort to find out if they're really correct or not, or even to examine at any great depth the possibility that all their findings are being confounded by the kind of issues I'm talking about, and other the methodologists, as they're known, have complained of, is to potentially put themselves out of business.
Mm-hmm. So,
And
so, so
very few of us are.
testing some, yeah, sorry. There's a little bit of a lag, I think. So testing a lot of this stuff experimentally could potentially put them out of business because it could invalidate, finding all of these associations in the first place. But even more fundamentally, I think the types of clinical trials necessary to test the work that we're talking about are so big and so expensive to run that in practice most people can't run most of the tests that would be necessary. So we're in the situation where there can be very little formal testing of the hypotheses that come from these associational studies. And so we're just stuck in this loop, this merry-go-round of more and more associational studies that get more and more attention, that justify doing more of it, all while there's really no way that this stuff's ever going to get tested because it's just too expensive and too difficult to do the requisite studies.
Well, again, it depends where your priorities lie. Okay. So if your priorities, and I've written about this in the past, and I helped co-found a not-for-profit that tried to solve this problem, even though it eventually evaporated. I started my career, as I said, I was embedded for 9 months. We say embedded now. I lived at 9 months at CERN, the big physics lab outside of Geneva. I lived in the hostel on a lab. I spent from 16 or more hours a day with the physicists, watching them realize how they had misinterpreted their experimental results. The physics community has specific questions they want answered. They know what they agree with these questions are. They agree that they're important, and they pretty much agree on the technology necessary to test them. And then they're willing to pool all their efforts into getting those experiments funded. And those are these now $10 billion plus particle accelerators with their $500 million to $1 billion detectors scattered around them that are all aimed at answering specific questions. In the military, you have naval destroyers, for instance, that cost $1 billion each. And last time I looked at one class, there were like 70 of these out there because we consider protecting our freedom with a viable Navy to be an extraordinarily important endeavor. The argument we've made, particularly with the obesity and diabetes epidemics, is that these epidemics are costing, direct cost to the healthcare system of diabetes is pushing $1 billion a day. You include diabetes and obesity, you probably double that. I forget the exact number,
but billions of dollars per day.
So we're talking hundreds of billions of dollars a year in societal costs, plus the emotional and the human health burden of living with these disorders. And the question is, how much do you want to spend as a society to solve them? Because you're not going to solve them from these observational studies. You're not going to solve them by giving us yet more advice from these that assume that these associations are causal when there's no reason to assume, no meaningful reason to assume that. The experiments could be done. I mean, if people want to make the effort, the problem is we have a research community that is fully funded to keep doing what they're doing. And we have a sort of philosophy that's willing to blame the continued increases in obesity and diabetes on the food industry, and ultimately on the individuals for not eating wisely or eating in moderation and exercising. And so there's a sort of perfect concoction of assumptions that allows people to say, we're doing the best we can. What more do you want from us? And if I challenge any particular individual in the community, as I've done, they will say, what do you want from me? And I'll say, well, I want you to care enough to say the current state of affairs is inadequate in the face of a human tragedy that's been building for decades. And you know,
So it
you
sounds
know
like
where that gets
it
us.
sounds like what you're saying is basically that there are social forces at work which dictate how research is being done. And so in the general realm of nutrition, epidemiology, and related fields, it's not the case that the questions around what causes obesity, doing the right experimental tests of various ideas, it's not that these things can't be done. And this is an insurmountable problem. We could structure the university industrial complex, we could structure the research world so we could pool resources and do the big expensive studies that would be necessary to address some of this stuff. But for whatever reason, social forces are at work that are preventing us from utilizing resources in that way. And we're just sort of on this treadmill of kicking out, association after association after association, and saying we're doing the best we can.
Yeah, and pushing for better and better drug therapy for the diseases out there. Among the thought constructs that perpetuate this thinking. So on one hand, clearly the obesity and diabetes epidemics are triggered by environmental factors. And by environmental, I mean lifestyle, diet and lifestyle. So it could be lack of exercise, sedentary behavior, could be eating too much, could be the refined carbs and sugars in the diets, as I've argued, could be the seed oils, as others have argued, could be some combination of this stew, as others have argued. There's a lot of hypotheses floating around out there. Many of them are dietary hypotheses, and I, it would be naive to think that diet isn't a trigger. And then the question is, what aspect of diet are we dealing with? The assumption is that nobody wants to change their diet. That given a choice between diet or pill, people want to take pills. This is why the GLP-1 agonist drugs have gotten such extraordinary attention.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, lo and behold, you don't have to diet, or we have a pill that'll help you diet, as the case may be. So pharmaceutical companies will spend billions of dollars developing these drugs because they also expect to get returns from it. Nobody, if you want to spend $1 billion for a clinical trial testing the carb hypothesis or the seed oil hypothesis, the best possible scenario from a public health perspective is it turns out to be true. And now you're telling people not to eat seed oils or not to eat
Mm-hmm.
refined grains and
And
sugars,
it's in
or
no
if
one's commercial interest for
it's
that to
to no
happen.
one's commercial interest. And yeah, and the research
Yeah.
community.
In fact, it's not simply that people won't be told to buy new drugs. It's that they'll be told to stop consuming some of the things they're already spending their money on. So it's actually against potentially people's interests.
Yeah, and despite the uh, government intervention to push, as I wrote about in my books, and Nina Teicholz, my colleague, has written about in her books, to push people to low-fat diets and low-saturated fat diets. The government has never gone after a particular food. Once it's generally recognized as safe, once it has GRAS status, or if it inherits GRAS status, the government isn't going to go after it. Nobody's going to say you should avoid processed foods, because ultimately they're saying, like, would you be healthier if you never eat a Snickers bar again, for instance? And I would argue, much as I loved Snickers when I was a kid, that the answer is probably yes. But the Food and Drug Administration doesn't see that as among their issues. The flip side is, if you could prove it's addictive, cigarettes were addictive, we could go after cigarettes because they were addictive. But even then, you don't make them illegal. You just counsel people not to smoke them. And alcohol, everybody accepts that alcohol has deleterious consequences, both for chronic diseases and for abuse, but we don't make it illegal. We just make kids have to wait until they're 18 or 21 before
Mm-hmm.
they drink responsibly.
Mm-hmm.
So, I always thought, if we can do the experiments, if we could convince the obesity researchers and the chronic disease researchers to do the correct experiments, we could get a trickle down effect where the physicians, the health organizations will at least know the correct advice to give. They'll get off their sort of
Mhm.
conventional, probably deleterious guidance and do the right thing. And but again, it starts with people doing experiments, and we've
Mhm.
talked about that.